All right, folks. So the agenda behind today's session is going to be machine learning algorithms, and you guys have covered a whole lot of these algorithms already as part of the class. But I wanted to do a quick refresher of a whole bunch of different algorithms that you'll see on the right. And as a generative AI manager at Apple, and I'm also a generative AI fellow at SDSU. I work with a whole lot of these different algorithms for various different industrial use cases. I know a lot of the momentum recently has been on the generative AI side of things in AI, but ML algorithms are absolutely pretty much utilized in a whole lot of different use cases, especially ones that are latency sensitive. So these algorithms that have shaped the field for quite a while and are the fundamental building blocks in machine learning, these are still very relevant, and I wanted to make sure that we utilize today's time to go over these algorithms, and most importantly, understand their pros and cons and use cases of each. So as part of every algorithm that we'll be discussing today, we'll do an analysis of pros and cons, where these algorithms, the specific algorithm fits best, and talk about what kind of use cases we see, especially like in the industry where, regression, for example, is still relevant, or decision trees, for example, is another very common one. So we'll be talking about those as well. So there will be a bit of an industrial flavor and an application flavor rather in each of these algorithms as we go about them one by one. So, we're going to get started. Like I said, ML algorithms is going to be the topic for today. We're going to start with regression. We're going to cover naive Bayes. We're going to cover SVMs, support vector machines. We're going to cover decision trees. And then we're also going to talk about ensemble methods, bagging and boosting and stacking as well. And then we're going to talk about k-means clustering and principal component analysis. And then finally, I have a couple of pointers for you guys to go deeper into each of these, because I know that this is a lot of um, stuff that we'll be covering today. So for next level detail, I have some pointers as well in case you guys want to dig further into any of these. But let's get started with regression. So linear regression is, one of the most common and most primitive machine learning algorithms. It's one of the most simplistic as well, and the idea is pretty simple. What regression does is it basically develops a relationship between input features and the output that is usually continuous, right? So in this, regression is meant for continuous output. We'll talk about linear regression in particular. We'll talk about other forms of regression that deal with discrete outputs as well, particularly logistic regression. So we have that coming up, on a future slide. But with linear regression, it makes a whole bunch of different assumptions, and it basically assumes that there is independence between the input features, and there's no multi-collinearity among predictors, right? So there's five or six different assumptions that linear regressions make. Any linear regression model, for it to be effective, right? So you want to make sure that these different aspects are being seen in your input data. So that's one thing to note here. And the other challenge with linear regression is that it is sensitive to outliers, and that in some cases heavily skews predictions. That's one thing that is something that as you model your data, and figure out which algorithm to use, you want to make sure that you've done some outlier analysis, and you've double checked that there are not many outliers, or you've trimmed the outliers out of the data set, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. um, Linear regression, as the name suggests, works best when the relationship between the variables, the input variable and the output variable, is kind of linear, right? So if you look at the diagram on the right, you'll see a whole bunch of different data points in red, and there is an approximate linear relationship, the line that passes through the data, that does need to exhibit a linear relationship. So that is the core assumption here. But otherwise, this is, like I said, one of the most simplistic, most primitive, and interpretable algorithms out there. So linear regression is favored in use cases where interpretability is a big requirement. It is simplistic, like we discussed, and computationally very efficient. Now, so those are its pros, but in terms of its cons, if the data doesn't exhibit a linear relationship, you will still end up with a linear regression model if you run the algorithm. There's nothing stopping you from coming up with the coefficients of the line, right? The slope and the theta values, slope and intercept, if it's a 2D linear regression model, as you see in the diagram on the right, theta 1 and theta 2. So you will still come up with those coefficients. You'll still build that model, but you won't see as much of great performance, right? If the relationship isn't linear between the input and output variables. Um, and also if the data is correlated, highly correlated in those cases as well, again, what happens is the model doesn't quite get as much unique, data with high entropy to leverage and to build a model around, right? If the variables are correlated, so in which case your model will likely lack in terms of performance. So that's another con. But in terms of use cases for linear regression models, we this is again a model that is very frequently utilized, especially in the industry. For because of its simplicity and interpretability, those are the two big things. So it's easily maintainable, for example, and if the data shows linear patterns, and if you want interpretability, this is the algorithm of choice typically. So that's what we have for linear regression.
I ask you a quick question because
Go ahead.
how often do you see this used in industry? Because I tell the students, because we covered a lot of linear regression for the last few weeks, actually.
Yes.
And part of it I told them is I've seen a lot of banks still use it because
Yes.
of low variance. That
Right.
it's not an amazing predictor, but sometimes the consistency
Yes.
actually is more important for a business. What's your take? What have you seen?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely spot on with the financial side of the industry, banks especially. The model simplistic and interpretable, right? So interpretability is absolutely vital when it comes to mission critical scenarios like finance, right? Especially say if it's a model that is trying to make a prediction for, say, financial use cases like loan applications, for example. We can't put in a model out there that won't let us peek under the hood and help us understand why it came up with a certain decision. Linear regression in those cases is favored, right? So we see that being deployed for a whole lot of applications that are mission critical. And on the tech side, right, we do see it being deployed very commonly, especially if it's latency. The fact is, once you come up with these coefficients, for the model, it is very easy to deploy this model during runtime and be able to make, inference, do inference with it, right? So that is a big selling point. As we talk about the more elaborate models, and as we get into generative AI, for example, or neural networks, a lot of these considerations do not hold as much. Interpretability becomes a big concern. Cost for inference is a concern. Latency becomes a concern. So we do see it being deployed every now and then, for all kinds of different use cases, especially with cost and latency and interpretability. Those are the three big axes along which it does very well. All right. Hopefully that gives a good idea about things and when and to favor a model like linear regression. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Mhm. All right. So we're going to move to logistic regression next, and I touched briefly upon logistic regression earlier. So linear regression is great when you're basically making a prediction on a continuous variable, right? But when you want to make similar predictions with a bunch of input features, similar to the kind of features you have for linear regression, but this time for discrete variables, where say you're doing binary classification. In those cases, you want to be able to output a probability value to make a decision between class A versus class B, right? And the way you get there is by using a sigmoid function on top of a regression model, which basically gives you that probability output, right? So it's a number between 0 to 1, which is the requirement for any probability value, this is what we obtain at the output of logistic regression via the sigmoid function. And again, in terms of how the algorithm is shaped up, it makes a lot of similar assumptions. There needs to be linear relationship between the features and the log odds of the outcome. And for logistic regression, we're able to handle categorical as well as continuous predictors both. So in that sense, it differs from linear regression, where you do need to have continuous predictors, right? We do not output a probability value at the output of a linear regression model, right? So that's one of the big differentiation points. But again, there's also the virtues of linear regression that carry over, because the foundation is pretty similar, with logistic regression compared to what we saw for linear regression, because at the end of the day, this is also a regression model with a sigmoid on top. So you do get that interpretability that we discussed in the last slide, and that is very beneficial, especially if you look at more recent models. LLMs have taken over, and they're being deployed for a lot of different applications, but the challenge is interpretability, right? So that is one of the biggest issues, and that conversely becomes one of the biggest selling points of things like linear logistic regression. So the interpretable coefficients that we generate as we fit the model, those are pretty useful. And again, the relationship between input and output features, that has to be linear, as we saw earlier with linear regression, because at the end of the day, it is the same foundation with the same model under the hood with the sigmoid layer on top. um, so in terms of pros, like we discussed, it is still a pretty simplistic model, interpretable, in fact much more interpretable than linear regression, especially for classification, because you get a probability value at the end, right? So you're able to figure out whether it was very confident when it made a prediction for a particular class, if that probability value was, say, zero point 0.8, 0.9 versus a zero point 0.6, for example, right? So even if you thresholded the probability value at 0.5, so less than zero point 0.5 would be a particular class A, versus more than zero point 0.5 to 1 would be class B. You at least know on that scale where logistic regression felt that this particular input sample would fall on, right? Is it a zero point 0.6 versus a zero point 0.8, zero point 0.9, right? So that interpretation really helps with these probability values. And you can also tune that threshold, right? So it needn't be zero point 0.5, right? If you really want to favor false positives versus false negatives as you come up with that classification model, you can tune that threshold easily, right? To go from zero point 0.5 to lower or higher, because that is just an if condition in code, right? To be able to sample the output of the sigmoid and then eventually threshold it with the number of your choosing. So that threshold is also tunable. And in terms of cons, linear logistic regression struggles with non-linear decision boundaries. So we'll see a whole bunch of different algorithms that do pretty well there in the coming slides. And use case, like I said, interpretability is key, and cost and latency are the other considerations as well. So very simplistic model, very easy to run during inference, and to minimize cost. So those are areas where it's favored. I'm gonna have some time at the end as well for questions, by the way. So if you got something, please, you're free to chime in right now. That's totally fine, or you can ask question at the end, no problem. Moving on to another type of regression model. This is called locally weighted linear regression. LWLR is what it's commonly called. And the idea is that LWLR is able to overcome a whole lot of limitations of linear regression that we've seen earlier, right? And the idea is pretty simple. What it does is that for each of the big prediction areas, as you'll see on the right, in the prediction, the decision boundary here, it develops local models for each area, thereby being able to simulate a non-linear decision boundary. That is the biggest selling point of locally weighted linear regression compared to plain old linear regression, where the decision boundary has to be linear. So I think it's a pretty innovative idea where you basically slice, your decision boundary in various regions, and come up with local models for each, thereby simulating a nonlinear boundary. And you can add weightage to each of these, to nearby data points. And for that, we basically just use kernel functions. And the beauty of the whole thing, the biggest selling point here, is that it adapts flexibly to nonlinear and complex patterns in data while using a linear regression model under the hood. So this is obviously, there's no free lunch. So it is computationally a bit more expensive because you have to fit multiple different models. And especially with large data set, that becomes a concern. But you would also, be storing the whole data set of predictions, right, for each different region for your decision boundary. So there is some memory intensiveness that comes in for storing each set of coefficients as well for every slice of the decision boundary. But it clearly has its pros, which is, it's able to capture local trends better. So it understands the various different areas within the decision boundary better, way better than linear regression, which is way more global, which has one decision boundary for the entire, landscape of data points. Scalability is a con, because, if you start slicing and dicing your decision boundary, you can come up with, so many different, slices, and then that will basically mean as many linear regression models for each slice. So there is some, there is a trade-off there. And each model has to be stored separately, right? Because each model will have its own coefficients. So that's one thing to consider. And but if you have a small data set, locally weighted linear regression has a great use case there. And if you see some strong local nonlinearity, this is the way to go. So this is the biggest use case for locally weighted linear regression, and this is how it basically overcomes some of the big limitations in terms of a linear decision boundary that we see in linear regression. All right, with that, we move on to naive Bayes. So naive Bayes is essentially it's a probabilistic classifier based on Bayes theorem, which makes an independence assumption. So if you look at the equation on the right, Naïve Bayes basically calculates the posterior probability, which is the part on the left, to the left of the equal to sign. So that's a posterior probability, which is the probability of the hypothesis given that the evidence is true. And on the right, there are three components that need to be put together to come up with that posterior probability, right? So the first one is the likelihood of the evidence given that the hypothesis is true, which is the reverse conditional probability, right? So that's a probability of the evidence given that the hypothesis is true into the prior, which is the unconditional probability of the hypothesis, and then that divided by the prior probability that the evidence is true is what the third component, right? So all of this put together, is what yields the posterior probability, which is what we use to model the data, right, given the hypothesis and the evidence. So the good part about naive Bayes is that, if you have high dimensional data, which is usually the case, various features, embedded in, even with a dense model, one of the more recent generative AI models, say with a BERT encoder, for example, you can still run a naive Bayes classifier on top of, a dense embedding, for example. So it works very well with high dimensional data. It is fast to train because all you have to do is figure out these three probability values, and those put together yields the final value, right? So it's easier to set up and train, and only requires a small set of training data to estimate parameters reliably. The challenge with using naive Bayes is that it makes an independence assumption here. It assumes that the features are independent, which is often an unrealistic assumption, especially in the real world, where there is interaction between features. Not all features are fully uncorrelated. So that relationship, whether it's monotonically increasing, decreasing, or a different kind of relationship between features, all of that has to be figured out, and it has to be independent if you want to deploy naive Bayes with great performance. um, which is another way of saying that if you've got correlated features, you'll see the performance dip. The accuracy will go down. So that's one important point of consideration here. But otherwise, as far as the pros are concerned, it's simple, fast, and things like spam filtering, for example. One of the earliest models that was deployed in the field, was a knife based classifier, because it's quick and you're able to label emails as spam and not spam very easily. And in terms of cons, as long as the independence assumption is satisfied, the model works well. But as soon as it's violated, you're gonna see accuracy drops. And which is why in use cases, as long as the independence assumption is satisfied, text classification, document categorization, all of that is fair game because it can easily work with high dimensional data. So that is the biggest selling point of Naïve Bayes. And
Last
next,
week, we actually covered linear discriminant analysis.
yes,
So, which is an application of this technique.
yeah, LDA, yeah,
And it's actually really nice. We were talking about how sometimes if your data are unstable or there's you don't have to, it's very different. It's completely different than logistic regression, yet you get a very similar solution. And
right,
so sometimes you use the discriminant analysis,
yeah.
which takes this concept of the probabilities but converts it from continuous data using the Gaussian density function. And then we
Mhm.
just solve for these and then plug them in. So students are actually somewhat familiar with this.
Yeah, I was actually planning to cover LDA as well and generalized linear models, GLMs as well. Um, the that would have been an even bigger repertoire of algorithms to cover. So I tried to limit
Yeah.
the scope a bit. But you're absolutely
Yeah.
spot on with that. And those are a big batch of algorithms to definitely have a background in, right? But Naive Bayes is one of the more simpler ones. So yeah, but next up, I do have a whole bunch of the others. So we're going to talk about support vector machines next, and then I have a bunch of slides on the decision tree side of things. Decision trees are also very commonly deployed in the industry, so we'll touch upon that as well. But let's get started with support vector machines. So support vector machines, or SVMs as they're commonly called, the idea is fairly simple. Given a landscape of data points, as you'll see on the right, this is a 2D representation, right? So you've got your x-axis and y-axis, x1 and x2 is how we've labeled it in the diagram here. But given a landscape, what we need to do is SVM basically figures out the maximum margin hyperplane which separates the two classes, right? So you'll see the red line going in between, which is basically the decision boundary. And the idea is to make sure that there's enough separation between the blue and the green classes. And these colors are just representing two classes, right? So it could be spam, not spam, for example, right? As far as the emails are concerned. But the idea is to come up with a decision boundary that has the maximum separation between the two classes, right? So that is the entire basis of SVMs. And one particular advantage of SVMs is that they're very effective in high dimensional spaces. And if you want to model a non-linear decision boundary, unlike the one that's here, which is linear, mm, SVMs basically have something called as a kernel trick, which basically lets you model a non-linear decision boundary as well. And there's a whole bunch of different kernels, that let you, figure out what kind of non-linear boundary you can have. So they do extend to non-linear boundary use cases. Um, and, more the clearer the separation between the classes via the hyperplane, better the performance of the algorithm. So that is the hyperplane, which is the separation between the classes. The yellow area in the diagram is the entire essence of SVMs. They're obviously sensitive to the choice of the kernel and the hyperparameters. And there is a computational effort required here, especially as you enter nonlinear decision boundaries, because then you have to run the kernel. And as the data set size increases, that complexity correspondingly increases as well. But in terms of the pros for SVMs, they are great for small or medium scale data sets. They are pretty robust to overfitting as well. So that's another yet great feature that we have with SVMs. In terms of cons, scalability is a concern. As data set size scales, as you utilize more complicated kernels to simulate even more intricate non-linear decision boundaries. For example, a spiral decision boundary, for example, right, where data points are all over the place, more the computational complexity, right, and thereby lack of scalability. And obviously, as we put together all of this and come up with these coefficients and fit that model, SVM model, you'll see that interpretability takes a hit, right, which was again the one of the most selling points as we got started with regression models that we saw earlier. So you do lose some of that interpretability, unless you stick to a very simple decision boundary and a simple model, in which case it resembles linear regression to some extent, right? So you get some interpretability in return. So that's one of the considerations to keep in mind. um, and in terms of use cases, like I said, right, if it's a small or medium scale data set, SVMs work well. And high dimensionality is again something that is, something that they easily support. Especially, like I said earlier, right, if you've got embeddings from a dense model, right, you use one of the more recent generative AI embedding models to generate an embedding out of text, right, say using a BERT model, you can still run a classifier on top of those embeddings. Use an SVM model, for example, to do classification. So that is doable because they support high dimensional data, right? And dense embeddings, say from a BERT model, could be 768 dimensional, for example. So they've got a lot of dimensions, and SVMs are easily able to support that. And obviously, like I said, the other biggest selling point that we touched upon earlier is nonlinear or complex decision boundaries, right? With kernels, we're able to simulate nonlinear boundaries as well. So that's another big use case for SVMs. All right. Next up, we've got decision trees. And I've got a bunch of slides covering various forms of ensemble methods using decision trees. So we'll talk about bagging, boosting, and stacking as well. But let's get started with plain old decision trees. So the idea behind a decision tree is to split data recursively based on thresholds at every node, feature thresholds at every node. So if you look at the diagram on the right, you'll see that we start off with the root node, right? And then we start coming up with these decision nodes that essentially threshold the data at that particular node based on a certain threshold value, which is basically trained during train time. And that is based on a particular feature within the data. So that is how these decision intermediate green colored decision nodes that you see on the in the diagram on the right, that is how they are formed. And then eventually that leads us to a prediction, which is what the leaf nodes suggest, right? So the final predictions are what are derived out of the leaf nodes. So that is roughly the structure of a decision tree, where you've got your root nodes, you've got your intermediate decision nodes, and then you have your final predictions, which are your leaf nodes, right? Um, Good thing about decision tree is that and which is why it's very favored in the industry, especially the ensemble methods that we're going to be touching upon. There's something called as gradient boosted decision trees. Those are the most common set of trees that we see in the field, especially with things like recommender systems, for example, because these it's very easy again to run these at runtime. Very quick, latency is low. So if you say are loading up your feed, right, on a social media app like your Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn or any other platform out there, typically a whole bunch of those pipelines do have decision trees at the back end powering at least one of those layers, usually multiple layers, as a whole lot of those candidates are retrieved and ranked to serve your to eventually shape up your feed and serve your feed. Some of those layers are powered by trees. That's very commonly seen because latency is low and the performance is pretty high. So that trade-off is, decision trees have a great balance there. So they're very favored in the industry, and they're easy to interpret as well. So you can look at the various decision nodes, understand how the tree came up with a particular prediction, right? And But if there's also a good chance of overfitting. So that's one area where decision trees sometimes lack performance, and we'll see some ensemble methods coming up later on that help with overfitting. Um, so uh, the idea is that decision trees come in a couple of different flavors. They're usually not deployed by themselves. We typically deploy an ensemble of decision trees, and I've mentioned random forest here, which is a bagging technique. Bagging stands for bootstrap aggregating. So, and we have a dedicated slide to talk about that. But there's random forest and there's gradient boosting, right? So those are the two most common set of bagging and boosting techniques, which we'll talk in more detail later. So this is just things at a top level. But the idea behind bagging is to reduce variance, right? Which basically makes the whole model less prone to overfitting. And the way it's doing that is by averaging multiple different trees, right? And again, like I said, we'll discuss this in more detail, but just at a top level, overfitting is a big concern with decision trees, and this is how we alleviate some of that concern. Gradient boosting is yet another technique. It's a boosting technique, as the name suggests, and it reduces bias. By basically coming up with sequential weak learners. Um, and the thing with gradient trees is whether it's numerical data or categorical data, it can handle everything. So, these are the two biggest types of data: numerical or categorical. Numerical is also continuous data, and whether it's continuous or categorical, it can handle both types of data. So that is the biggest selling point of decision trees, and they're pretty flexible, interpretable, and you get a good bang for buck in terms of the accuracy versus the cost slash latency. Um, and they're able to capture nonlinear relationships pretty well too. So they've got a nice mix of all of the good virtues that we saw so far, right? And a good kind of good trade-off on most of these dimensions. Cons, as you come up with ensembles to avoid things like overfitting, you're going to lose some of that interpretability, right? So that is one concern. And as you set up, a whole bunch of multiple different models while you're setting up your ensemble, it can be computationally intensive. So that's one big concern. But otherwise, they're pretty much used for their interpretability, and ensembles are perfect for accuracy and robustness. So, like I mentioned earlier, we've got a couple of slides on ensemble methods. So I'm going to go over those. And the idea behind an ensemble method is pretty simple, right? The idea is to just put together multiple models, and basically, it's called wisdom of the crowd, right? Where you're basically setting up multiple different models, and then coming up with a final prediction that amalgamates the output of each model to improve accuracy and robustness, right? So bagging is one technique, boosting is another, and stacking is yet another. Those are the three most common ensemble methods that we see in the field. And out of these three, I'd say bagging and boosting are the most common ones. So, you'll come across them every now and then. And like we touched upon in the last slide, bagging, of which random forest is a type, the goal is to reduce variance for bagging, and that is done through averaging. So you come up with a whole bunch of different models, like you'll see in the image on the right. Under bagging, you'll see a whole bunch of different models being trained in parallel. And then finally, you basically either average the prediction if it's a continuous output, or you do a majority vote and come up with a discrete output if it's a classification problem statement. Boosting, trains models in a sequential manner, which is the opposite of how bagging does it. And it reduces bias, where each model is basically learning to improve itself based on the errors of the prior model, right? So that's how it reduces bias, but is sequential in nature. So it takes a good amount of time to train these models one after the other, versus bagging, which is more parallel. And stacking, which is yet another method, what it does, it basically trains multiple base models on the same data set, just like bagging does it. And then what it does is it basically trains a meta model on top of these predictions of the base models. So in a way, stacking fuses the virtues of both bagging and boosting, where model training for base models is in parallel, and then the meta model learns to come up with a final prediction based on the base model predictions. So that is stacking. And the idea behind all of these three different variants of ensemble methods is to outperform single learners, right? That is, so essentially you're getting wisdom, the wisdom of the crowd, and being able to put together, an output or a prediction that is way more accurate compared to just one model. Now, there is a challenge here, though, right? If you were to use multiple models, you're going to start modeling the noise in the data, input data too, which will lead to overfitting, especially if the models that you're training as part of the ensemble are too complex. So that's one important piece of information to consider. But in terms of a quick summary of the pros cons, obviously, like I said, the biggest selling point here is higher accuracy, robustness, non-linearities are also handled well. But the cons in return, for getting all of the good stuff, the higher accuracy and robustness, you get a model that's less interpretable, right? Because you have multiple different coefficients now from all of these models to look at to understand why it came up with a certain prediction. And obviously higher computational cost to train all of these models and to run inference. So that's another piece that needs to be considered. But if predictive accuracy is critical and interpretability isn't as essential, these are still very commonly deployed in the field. All right. I have a comparative analysis of all of these, the three methods that we just discussed. So I'm just going to go over those quick. We covered most of these points in the last two slides, but just to drill down the points, for bagging versus boosting versus stacking. The idea, obviously, like I said, with bagging is that it trains models in parallel, on bootstrap samples, and boosting, on the other hand, is more sequential. While stacking, you can combine various diverse kinds of models. You don't even need to stick to trees. And ultimately, you can just build a meta learner to blend in all of those predictions to come up with the final prediction. Um, Bagging, the idea is to reduce variance, while boosting is more, to reduce bias. And stacking is a combination of both. So it leverages the virtues, like I said, of both bagging and boosting. The entire idea behind bagging is to reduce variance, like I just mentioned, which means you're basically reducing the amount of overfitting that's happening in the data. While boosting can lead to overfitting because it is reducing bias and not variance, but it does achieve higher accuracy than just a single learner, single model. Um, on the other hand, stacking does lead to an increase in accuracy again because you've got multiple models and base models and a meta model. But again, it's complex and it is way more harder to tune as you come up with even diverse models as part of diverse model architectures as part of your base models. So those are some of the different pros and cons of bagging versus boosting versus stacking. But ultimately, if you're looking to reduce overfitting or reducing variance, bagging should be the method of choice. Boosting is required if you're looking to reduce bias, and stacking is should be the method of preference if you're looking to maximize your predictive power and you're ready to handle the complexity of multiple different models from different architectures, and also putting together a meta learner, yet another, which is going to be yet another model on top of these base models. All right, just doing a time check, kind of short on time. So I'm going to go over these relatively quick so we have a little time at the end for questions because I need to wrap up before 5. But coming to clustering, clustering is an unsupervised learning algorithm, which basically means there's no labels to the data. Supervised learning algorithms have labels. And the idea is to partition the entire data set into k clusters, where k is an integer number that needs to be specified manually. So you come up with the number of clusters, and the job of k-means clustering is to come up with those clusters for you. Right. So what it does is it basically assigns these data points to the nearest centroid, which is essentially the mean or the average of all of the points within a particular cluster, and it starts iteratively updating these centroids as part of a for loop, right? And once it basically once we do not see as much of a movement in the centroids, that's when the algorithm converges, and that's when you have all of your clusters created. So that is how the algorithm goes through its training loop, and it works very well if the clusters are spherical and they're equally sized. So that is an important point of consideration. It does require you to specify the value of k beforehand, and there are variants that led to do not require have that requirement, right? So these different variants figure out the value of k as they run. So density based scanning, for example, and the hierarchical variant in particular, HDB scan is one example where you do not need to specify k and it figures out k by itself. But plain old k-means clustering, you do need to specify k. It is sensitive to how the clusters are initialized initially, so that is one point of consideration. But otherwise, it's computationally efficient and it scales pretty well on large data sets. Very commonly used in the initial phases of AI projects where you have a bunch of data and need to make sense of the data. So all we do is we come up with clusters and understand what kind of data samples we're seeing. But in terms of pros, it's pretty simple, fast, and used for exploratory data analysis, like I just mentioned. And in terms of cons, if the clusters aren't spherical, they have weird shapes, and basically that means they have a bunch of outliers. You'll see a whole lot of, you'll see it not converging well, right? So that, and especially if you do not have a value of k, if you don't have a hunch about the data, then that makes it, an even bigger challenge. But if for quick clustering and initial exploratory data analysis, as we receive a data set and we're looking to make sense of the data, this is the method of choice. And especially if it's higher dimensional data, we can carry out dimensionality reduction, which is the next slide, where we reduce the dimensionality of the data, and then you can run k-means clustering on top of that reduced dimensional data to be able to make sense of it. So it does work with high dimensional data after you do dimensionality reduction. So that is how we make use of k-means clustering for various different use cases. All right, and with that, we get to principal component analysis. Now, this is also yet another unsupervised technique, just like k-means clustering, and the idea is pretty simple with PCA. Given a high-dimensional data set, the role of PCA is to bring down the number of dimensions, where it basically, and the way it basically accomplishes that is it transforms correlated features into uncorrelated principal components, and you'll see the diagram on the right that lists all of the steps it goes through to get there. And let me just give you a quick overview of that. So when I say principal components, those are essentially the eigenvectors of the data covariance matrix. So our job is to first come up with a data covariance matrix to understand what the covariance is between various different dimensions of the data, and taking eigenvectors of those is basically what we do to come up with the principal components of the data, right? So eigenvalues are and eigenvectors are obtained, and eigenvalues are basically, you know, uh, they're indicative of variance, which is explained by each different eigenvector component within the data. Now, once you have these two aspects of your data, these two facets of your data figured out, the eigenvalues and the eigenvectors, all you have to do is you want to make sure that you capture the most variance, the maximum variance in as fewer dimensions as possible. Because ultimately, the goal behind dimensionality reduction is to figure out the dimensions of the data that have the most variance, where data has a lot of entropy and characteristic that it's trying to exhibit, right? You don't want correlated dimensions as much as possible. So that's exactly what PCA does. So once it figures out the maximum variance and the dimension that show maximum variance, it basically it trims those out of the data, and that's how you get a data set in a reduced dimensional form. And this is very commonly used again for visualization, for example. So as we're looking to understand a data set, we typically use PCA to bring down the dimensions and to visualize it in a 2D or 3D plot. But as you reduce the challenges, as you reduce the dimensions, you lose some interpretability. So that is another con that needs to be figured out, that needs to be considered. But otherwise, it is very commonly used when, especially with high dimensional data, and it does speed up computation, because once you have a lower dimensional data set, you're able to operate much faster with any algorithm of choice after. So that's PCA. Let me do a quick time check. We have a couple of minutes. Now, I know we covered a whole lot of things, and I want to have a couple of minutes for questions, but I did want to share a resource. So I put together a whole bunch of what we discussed and a comparative analysis of all of these different algorithms and what to use when in this primer that I have on my website. So just wanted to link you guys to that if you'd like to do some further reading. I have a lot of more information beyond what we discussed in today's slide, a lot more next level detail. So feel free to go over that. The URL is down below, and we'll be sharing these slides as well. So you guys can go through some of this content offline. All right. With that, we're at the end of today's lecture, and I'm happy to take any questions for a couple of more minutes. So yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Somebody else can go first if you're asking a question.
Oh, yes. I just have a quick question about k-means clustering.
Mhm.
So usually if data sets are imbalanced, most of the time maybe, how
Yeah.
does k-means address imbalanced data sets, and what strategies would you recommend?
Right. That's a great question. K-means clustering inherently does not do much to particularly handle imbalanced data sets.
Mm,
So if you do have an imbalanced data set and if you run k-means clustering on top, you will see imbalanced clusters.
I
All
see.
right, there is nothing in the algorithm that treats or considers the magnitude of data set imbalance and normalizes it in some way, right? So here's what you
Mm-hmm.
do if you have an imbalanced data set. So you basically do a pre-processing step where you're oversampling the minority class. You could do that by synthetically generating data, for example, especially data points near the decision boundary of
Mm-hmm.
the, two classes if it's a binary classification problem. So you start oversampling the minority class, you start undersampling the majority class, and put together that balanced data set before you do k-means clustering. So that's typically the way to get there.
Mm,
But inherently, there isn't any consideration for data set
but,
balance or imbalance within
I
k-means.
see. All right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for presenting today. My questions are more geared towards you working for a generative AI at Apple.
Mhm.
Um, so I've been looking at a few job opportunities, and that's kind of where my head is at in terms of my career after master's. Um, and I'm more of in the GIS and data management type of field, but could you tell me a little bit about that? And to be specific, what do they like ask of you for like interviews or just on working there? And I know it's a little bit different with you focusing on generative AI.
Yeah, I'm happy to touch upon that. I can give you an overview. I think it'll be best to take this offline. My email is on the slide. It's
Okay.
hi@aman.ai. You're free to email me and send me a quick note that this is part of the lecture that we had, so I have context and I can give you some pointers to give you a little more detail about the kinds of roles and what typically these companies look for in terms of a skill set, if that's what you're interested in.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Can you CC me too?
Sure.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah. And any other questions that I can take?
Um, if nobody else, then I guess I have like a question about, because my program is cybersecurity.
Mhm.
I guess what potential can you see about roles that intersects both areas, I would say.
Yeah, the AI and cybersecurity together, there's a lot of different application domains.
Mm,
We're working on a research project, for example, that is looking at synthetic data generation for
mm,
to figure out IP access patterns, right, and train models that are able to block certain connections, thereby limiting a DDoS attack, for example. Or just for even as you set up a firewall, for example, right? So uh, there's many ways to train some of these models better, and synthetic data generation is one subset of AI, which you can use a whole bunch of these models for. But I mean, we've used generative AI models, LLMs, for example, for a whole bunch of the data generation for this particular project. But that's one use case. There are classification, for example, is a very commonly applied problem or problem
mm,
that is powered by one of these models in the domain of cybersecurity, right? How do you identify a particular type of attack as one of the, say, n types of attacks that your system recognizes, right? So that would be a classification model, right, based on, say, access patterns. How do you identify an email as a phishing email versus a regular email That's also a classification problem. So I think there's a lot of use cases, you know, and this is an area, upcoming area of research. There's a lot of work being done, you know, and but the scope is definitely there. It's pretty significant for cybersecurity crossed with AI.
Nice. Thank you.
All right.
Appreciate that.
For sure. Yeah. We're at time, so let's wrap up.